Welcome to Communists of America podcast. Today, we see that people don't feel represented by the system, by the politicians. They feel like they're being robbed and like the system is rigged for the rich. And we would say that is absolutely correct. So today we have Tom Trottier and Erica Radel here with us to discuss how the government, American democracy, is not a democracy for the people in general, but rather a democracy that works for the rich, for the ruling class, which is the bankers, the Fortune 500 CEOs, the American capitalists, and Wall Street.
There's a growing anger. There's a growing disillusionment that the American people have with the government. In fact, they're starting to see that this government is not their government, it's a government of the rich. A recent poll showed that 70% of Americans say that the US economic system unfairly favors the rich and powerful. In addition to that, another poll showed that a big majority think that politicians, large corporations, and wealthy people have too much power and influence today.
Yeah, and these wealthy groups of people, right, they have much higher proportion of influence over the government. This is a fact. You know, we see that public opinion, on average, has a near zero, statistically insignificant impact on public policy. But the economic elites, the organized groups representing the capitalists and their interests have basically way more independent impacts on U.S. government policy.
So basically what people think, what people want has near zero impact on government outcomes, on policy, on legislation that's actually passed. And I think, of course, these are statistics and studies that show in a much more scientific way something that I think a lot of people, as we described, instinctively can feel. And this is something that Marxists have analyzed. Marx and Engels and Lenin talk about this. There's a very good book by Lenin titled The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, where Lenin says that it is natural for a liberal to speak of democracy in general, but a Marxist will never forget to ask for what class. In this case, it's democracy for the capitalists, for the bourgeois class. Another very good quote, I think this one is from The State and Revolution, which, by the way, we sell in our bookstore, marxistbooks.com. I encourage anyone who hasn't read it to read it. Lenin says that in capitalist society, democracy is always hemmed in by the narrow limits set by capitalist exploitation. It's democracy for the minority, democracy only for the propertied classes, for the rich. And I think there's a lot of examples that we're going to get into in this episode. I think maybe we can start with the election campaign. It's in full swing. You have Kamala running against Trump, very unpopular candidates, actually. And yet you saw that just in the month of August, Kamala Harris raised $300 million. So I think that really gives you an idea of the scope of money that these people are managing.
Yeah, there's absolutely a ton of money in politics and political campaigns. It's its own industry to itself. And you look at the money that's going into these campaigns from super PACs, right? These organizing groups that have tons of companies pool in their money for a particular party, for a particular candidate, with barely a veneer to make it legal and not be outright bribery towards campaigns. But in 2020, in 2024, the numbers aren't complete yet. We don't have the totals because the campaign's still ongoing. But in 2020, you had top donations from PACs like Future Forward USA. They all have these names: Future Forward, Unite America, very positive sounding names. But behind those, right, Future Forward USA, funded by Bloomberg with $24 million, funded by Euclidean Capital, which is a hedge fund manager, with another $12 million. Trump, likewise, received through all these super PACs, 10 million from Disney, 10 million from Energy Transfer Partners, which is an oil and gas company that was actually in the news in, I think, 2018, 2019, as being held criminally responsible for pipeline explosions and fined $30 million. This is a pipeline explosion in Beaver, Pennsylvania. And they obviously, their industry is transporting fracked gas. So naturally they have interest in that industry, and supporting those candidates is a way to secure their interests.
So yeah, there's hundreds of millions of dollars that are spent every single election, and not just, by the way, from the super PACs, but also all these media consulting firms and all these institutions that are used to basically try to prop up the candidates, which are candidates of the billionaires. We've been pointing out as part of our Class War 2024 campaign. You have two candidates and two parties, from the Republicans and the Democrats, that are capitalist parties. Of course, capitalism right now, we see there's polls that show it's not a very popular system, actually, right? There's a declining popularity of capitalism. A lot of people are looking to socialist and communist ideas. And so they need to prop up their system through all these means. They basically buy out the media, and they pump in millions and millions and millions of dollars in an attempt to support their system.
For example, a media consultant firm, Waterfront Strategies, they received $656 million in 2022. And this is part of a firm that was founded by Jim Margulis, a top campaign consultant for President Barack Obama when he was president, Hillary Clinton. And it's not actually legal, right, for this super PAC money to go directly to the consultants working directly with the candidates and their campaigns. And so they basically have a wall in the same building that separates the two, which shows basically such a veneer. They put a thin veneer between, like, you know, what's legal, and even by their own rules, by their own laws, they're skating on thin ice.
This also proves, by the way, sometimes people have illusions that you can pass a law and you're going to restrict corruption, or you're going to restrict the influence of business in politics. You can see they can get around any and all laws and find ways to make sure that they continue to assert the influence of the interests of the capitalist class as a whole. And I think, therefore, it's no surprise that there's statistics that show that 85% of Americans think the cost of political campaigns makes it hard for good people to run for office, which, I mean, obviously we would say it's not just a question of good people versus bad people, but I think the implication here is that the people who run are all bad, because precisely they represent the interest of those billionaires that are controlling all of the campaigns that they run. By the way, it's not just the traditional media that is doing this, but you also had a recent scandal where both parties, I would assume, are basically buying off online influencers, TikTokers, podcasters, social media people, and they're basically paying them millions of dollars so that they endorse one candidate or another. There's actually one particular influencer, Tana Mongeau, who spoke up about this because she was approached by the GOP and they offered her, a few $1 million to endorse Trump. And allegedly there's a list that they showed her of hundreds of other influencers that had already accepted the deal. So of course they try to reach people wherever they're at, whether it's on TV, in the newspapers, and where a lot of young people are nowadays, which is on the internet. Yeah,
well, what you both have been describing is a government that's, basically for sale, right? and the capitalists are looking for the best government that they can buy. And yes, they have tremendous control through financial and political institutions and other social and educational institutions over trying to manufacture public opinion. In fact, when we talk about public opinion is not an authentic sense of what people really think, but it is controlled by the dominant class of society. Marx and Engels always say the dominant ideas of any class society are the ideas of the ruling class. However, there's one problem for the capitalists, and that is that, yes, they do have all this power. They do have this ability to shape ideas and public opinion, but that comes into contradiction with real people's experience in life. And when they see that what they're told to think and how they're told to think comes into contradiction with their real life experience, Hence, that creates openings. And out of those contradictions, things can get resolved in a different manner. That's how, for example, the class struggle can, as a byproduct of the class struggle, workers come to see themselves as a separate class with a separate interest and start to group together, especially the more advanced layers at first, and then the larger layers in the end, to try to put forward an alternative view, a more accurate view of the world, the way the world really is organized, and to start to fight for their own interests, their own class interests, as opposed to the interests of the ruling class.
And you can see this, right, because you're seeing hundreds of millions of dollars being poured into the media, poured into, buying off influencers and all of these other avenues to try to control, what people think. And yet you still also see these polls that say, there's too much money in politics. The government represents the rich. You're seeing all these people still coming to those conclusions, despite the fact that they don't have, access to any of this media that says otherwise.
And that's also, by the way, why we, the revolutionary communists of America, have to find our own means to get our ideas out there through leaflets, through our own newspaper, The Communist, our theoretical magazine, In Defense of Marxism, our podcast. All of these are tools that we have been putting to use throughout our Class War 2024 campaign. We go door knocking, we go tabling, all of this, and it's having a very good impact. But this is only achieved because we have our own fundraising. We rely on donations and dues and help that we get from our members, sympathizers, from all the working class supporters, basically. And that really points out to the importance of having independent financing. If you're going to have an independent view, a working class view that goes against the interests of the big monopolies of the capitalist class and the capitalist politicians that represent them. Lenin, in The State and Revolution, quoted Engels, where Engels said that in a democratic republic, wealth exercises its power indirectly, but all the more surely. On the one hand, in the form of the direct corruption of officials, of which America provides the classical example, and on the other hand, in the form of an alliance between government and the stock exchange. So basically in the US with lobbying, what you end up having, it's legal corruption. So it's like the sanction within the bounds of the bourgeois law. They allow a certain degree of corruption out in the open through which the capitalists control the government. And in fact, their statistics, these statistics are from 2015, so they might be a little bit out of date, but I think it still illustrates the point that in 5 years alone, the 200 most politically active companies in the US spent $5.8 billion influencing the government. And those same companies got a nice return from that investment. They got $4.4 trillion in taxpayer support. So basically, that's a 750 times return on their investment. And that's just through basically tax cuts and subsidies and benefits. Plus, you could imagine all kinds of other nice gifts that they get, whether it's contracts for, or being allowed to have the fracking and oil and all these kinds of stuff, right?
Yeah, and I mean, it's with capitalism, the idea was that one person would get one vote, right? You'd have that's supposed to be the idea of democracy, but it's really $1 equals one vote, right? And the people have a lot of the dollars to get a lot of the votes, and people are seeing that because if you look at the another recent poll, it said 8 in 10 adults say that people who donate money to political campaigns have too much influence on the decisions of the Congress, and they say 73% of the people polled said lobbyists and special interest groups have too much influence. That, in a certain sense, is just showing you the dichotomy that people feel. Yeah, well, I may have a vote, but it's really the money that controls everything, right?
By the way, we were talking right before this episode about where the word lobbying comes from.
Oh yeah, interesting. A lot of people don't know that. In the U.S. Capitol, there's a very large lobby, right? And at one time, the bribery was so open, they literally had people who were trying to influence the government would be standing in that lobby, and they'd try to meet the congressmen and the senators and literally stuff money in their pockets. That's where the term lobbyists come from. These were the people hanging out in the lobby of the Capitol. Nowadays, they may not hang out in the lobby of the U.S. Capitol, but they still find a way to get money to whoever they need to in order to get that kind of influence. And another example example, by the way, is if you remember back when Obama was president, when he was proposing his health care plan. And his healthcare plan, just to remind people, wasn't a national healthcare plan, but it actually was a series of subsidies to all kinds of healthcare industry, companies that make a lot of money off people's healthcare. And so therefore, healthcare is big business in this country. So there's a lot of money involved. So just to show you the lobbying that was involved, according to some statistics I've seen, more than $1.1 billion was spent on lobbying the initial version of Obamacare in 2009. And then also in 2009, the pharmaceutical industry spent $1.2 million on lobbying each day on average. That industry involved itself in massive lobbying. And of course, their investment paid off, right? Because the bill that ended up coming out of the Congress that Obama agreed to, it allowed tremendous profit taking. They didn't have these government controls on prices, et cetera. So
there's a website, by the way, maybe if people want to check it out, it's called opensecrets.org. Following the money in politics. Of course, another big lobbyist right now that it might be on people's minds is AIPAC.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about getting a return on your investment. You have pro-Israeli lobbyists pumping tons of money into the U.S. Congress. AIPAC spent $58 million on current Congress members, and only really like 33 Congress members did not receive these donations. So essentially, 95% of Congress has gotten pro-Israeli AIPAC support.
And just to be clear, U.S. imperialism, wanted to support Israel because that's a point of support for maintaining the U.S. empire in the Middle East, right? There's much profit making, there's much trade, there's much strategic value to being in the Middle East, and the U.S. Set up Israel for a particular reason and maintains Israel for a particular reason. So that wing of the American bourgeois, which profits off that, particularly in some cases directly, is obviously funding the donations to AIPAC.
Absolutely, and that's good to point out because I think sometimes out there you see conspiracy theories like, Israel controls the world and this and that. No, the point is Israel would not exist if it weren't for the U.S. The U.S. propped it up as a strategic stronghold for its interest in the Middle East, as you pointed out. And I think generally, too, there's a lot of conspiracy theories about, there being an elite that controls the world. And you can see where this comes from, because there is an elite that controls the world, but it's not Illuminati, it's not some kind of like alien people or whatever, none of that. You don't have to look far. It's the capitalists I think sometimes, or QAnon and all these weird things, you can see there's a material root to those conspiracies, but I think if you take a materialist approach and you actually just look at where the money's coming from, it's very clear, it's out there. That's the legal corruption, basically the lobbying through which the Wall Street and basically the capitalist class as a whole exerts its control of the U.S. government.
Yeah, it's not a conspiracy, it's a class. The United States has 330 million people. It's a lot of people, right? The richest 10%, like let's say the richest 1 or 2%, 3% are the bourgeois, the capitalist class. And then the next, let's say 7% are the upper middle class, right? So the richest 10% own 93% of all stock. Right? The value of all stock in this guy. Stock is meaning you own the corporations, and the corporations own the means of production. So it's not a conspiracy, it's a class. You can't take 33 million people and put them in a room to create a conspiracy. It's a class. It's a class society. There's a class that benefits as opposed to the rest of the class. So it's definitely not a conspiracy. It's a class society. That's why Marxism understands what's going on, not conspiracy theories.
And Marxists do want to change that. We want to have a classless society where it's actually the majority of society that decides what's good, what should be in law, and we'll get into that later in the episode. But just one more thing that I wanted to point out is, of course, there's all this money that's being pumped into it. There's also a lot of synchronicity, if you will, between who is in the government and who is in the corporations. Like sometimes it's literally you have CEOs that become politicians. In fact, most of Eisenhower's cabinet were CEOs. I was reading this little write-up about his cabinet where basically he appointed a cabinet of mostly pragmatic businessmen And everyone in his cabinet, except for one, I think it was the Secretary of Labor, who was the president of the Plumbers and Steamfitters Union. Everyone else were pragmatic businessmen, CEOs, and so forth. And so the cabinet actually became known as 9 millionaires and a plumber, which shows just how out in the open they were about it.
As Marx and Engels said, right, the government of the capitalist class is basically like their executive arm that runs society for their interests. In the case of Eisenhower's cabinet, the defense secretary, I believe, was a guy named Charles Wilson, who came from General Motors. He was a CEO of General Motors, and he's famous for saying that what's good for General Motors is good for the country. So it's not a coincidence that he probably said that, right?
Yeah, and I think now they tend to be a little bit more careful. I mean, more or less more careful with who they put. Like they don't literally take CEOs and put them in the government. But that's not to say, obviously, that you don't have a lot of millionaires and billionaires that have a lot of say in politics. Even if you just look at the net worth of the last 2-3 presidents, Biden, Trump, and Obama, the net worth of their cabinets. Joe Biden, I was reading an article from some liberal press that said, Joe Biden's cabinet looks rather different from Donald Trump's, with more women, more people of color, more liberals. But it also had a super majority of millionaires, including Biden himself, by the way. As a whole, if you add up their net worth, they're worth $118 million overall. Under Trump, though, the cabinet was worth $6.2 billion. This from the guy who was going to drain the swamp, right? He was going to clean up Washington. And it's interesting, too, if you look at the Secretary of Commerce, because, right, that's the people that's in charge of business in the U.S. Under Trump, it was Wilbur Ross, the founder of a private equity fund. Under Obama, the Secretary of Commerce was Penny Pritzker, who was the heir to the Hyatt Hotel, who was worth $2 billion. The Secretary of Commerce's net worth was $2 billion. And the cabinet under Obama as a whole, by the way, was worth $2.8 billion. So I guess $2 billion out of the $2.8 was just from the Secretary of Commerce under Obama. Under Biden, Gina Raimondo is only worth $10 million, although again, she has lots of connections with banking and venture capital firms. She herself was a founder of a venture capital firm. And by the way, the venture capital firm that she set up was partnering with and had an investor who was a hedge fund billionaire, Paul Tudor Jones II, who was himself involved in a corruption scandal, possible corruption scandal, because the state of Rhode Island invested $5 million into one of his funds, and then he became treasurer of Rhode Island, and then later on became governor of Rhode Island. So you see there's this kind of revolving door of business interests going into Washington and coming out of Washington.
Yeah, absolutely. And people can see this, right? Roughly 8 in 10 Americans say that members of Congress do a bad job of keeping their personal financial interests separate from their work in Congress, which is to say they all have financial interests that they represent, right? And you see this because you see people moving from the defense contractors industry into politics, into the Department of Defense, and then back again once they retire from politics. There's also all this insider trading that goes on. There's think tanks, right? All of these tools that the companies use to set policy, to integrate their interests, their for-profit interests with the government, with the state.
Absolutely. On that point, by the way, of the revolving door, I think it was Dick Cheney, who was vice president under George W. Bush. He was also in Bush's father cabinet. What was his position there?
I think he was Secretary of Defense under George H.W. Bush,
So there you have it. And then he was VP under George W. Bush. And he was he had some kind of role in Halliburton, right? So basically oil, energy, an energy company. And we know, for example, the Iraq War is what was going on there.
They were doing business with the Pentagon during the Iraq War.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. There's all kinds of examples in terms of, I mean, you could, to be honest, just doing research for this podcast, it's like this rabbit hole. You follow one thread and it's like never ending. There's so many examples of the legal and illegal corruption that goes on. So we could go on and on and on, have 10 episodes on this. But just quickly on defense spending, since you mentioned that one in particular, Erica, from 2011 through 2022, more than 3/4 of defense sector lobbyists previously worked in the federal government. We know that there's a lot of money to be made in the war industry. The warmongers, all these companies are making a killing out of the conflict in Gaza, the tens of thousands of people that are being slaughtered there, out of what's happening in the Ukraine as well. Joe Biden's 2024 budget, as we know, has a huge record $886 billion set aside for defense spending. But of that, 1/3 of the defense budget actually goes to 100 contractors, so private companies that make profits from the war. It's like Lenin said, right? He said, war is terrible. Yes, it's terribly profitable.
Yeah, the big money is at the federal level, but there's also money at the state level, and there's money at the local level too. Some like 63% of all Americans say that all or most of the people who currently serve as elected officials ran for office to make a lot of money. And certainly we could see examples of that in the news. I want to start by, talk about New York City. New York City, the mayor is involved in a corruption scandal. By the way, this is not the first time that's happened. Back in the 1980s, when Mayor Koch was a really reactionary mayor, very racist, when he was mayor, he was engulfed in a corruption scandal, which involved a whole bunch of Democratic Party machinery in like the Bronx machines, the Queens machines, etc. And in the Bronx, the head of the Bronx Democratic Party at that time, Stanley Friedman, he was taking so much money. He actually had a sign in his office that said, "Politics pays better than crime." Now that tradition continues today because we see Mayor Eric Adams now, and he was being indicted by the federal government. By the way, it's the first time apparently the federal government indicted a New York City mayor, but not the first time they should have indicted, but this is the first time it actually happened. He's accused of accepting something like $100,000 in illegal gifts from the government of Turkey. He doesn't like to fly in anything but the most luxurious airlines apparently, and I guess he was put up in a hotel room and he had a butler, a full-time butler in the hotel room. Very, very, very nice deal. Those are the perks that come from serving the bourgeois as the mayor of its biggest city in the United States. And there are other people in his administration are also either being indicted or on the verge of being indicted. You have this scandal with the police commissioner where he had to resign recently because he and his brother had some sort of scheme of basically they were getting paid off by people who own bars and clubs, and then there was some sort of protection racket.
Yeah, what happened there is I think the brother, this is all alleged by the way, but allegedly the brother of the police commissioner, Caban, the brother owns a private security firm that works with bars and clubs. And so those bars and clubs that contracted that security company would get special treatment from the NYPD, allegedly. And those that didn't would get special treatment the other way, extra harassment and controls and all of this. And of course also that police officers that went along with this racket would get promoted, and those that didn't would probably get pushed to the side. So you can see it's like the mafia, right? Yeah. I mean, it's.
You're not describing an episode of The Sopranos, right? This is the real thing of New York City government. And then, of course, our former governor in New York, Andrew Cuomo, another bourgeois politician, he himself had to resign over some allegations of alleged sexual assault or whatever. But there were a number of his aides, a number of his appointees who were convicted of taking bribes from real estate developers and stuff. But not to worry, the U.S. Supreme Court stepped in and said, they threw out some of these convictions, and they basically said, you're not going to trample on the right the capitalists to pay off officials, public officials, and government officials to get them to do what they want. So the Supreme Court is protecting the right of capitalists to bribe their elected officials and appointed officials in government.
That was earlier this year, by the way, and I think people should look it up because it's really hilarious. The writing where they threw out those cases, they say, is basically restricting anti-corruption laws, and it says, it's not okay to take bribes, which might influence your policy decisions and so forth. So before the fact, you can't take bribes. But if you get a little tip afterwards, like a reward on a job well done, that we can't restrict. That's very American.
And you wouldn't know that you're going to get that money, right? Because you never know, right?
Exactly, but that's the logic. That's the logic.
Surprise.
and we'll talk more about the Supreme Court later, but it really shows you again, even in terms of the illegal corruption, they do curb some of the worst abuses. But on the whole, even they'll change the laws to make it work for them.
No corruption on the Supreme Court at all.
And it's not just New York. I think again, we don't have time to get into all the corruption that goes on, but in California, there's been a whole series of corruption scandals where more than 50 key political figures and executives in LA and San Francisco have been convicted since 2019 on charges along the lines of tax evasion, racketeering, bribery, fraud, making false statements in connection with a corruption investigation, embezzlement, perjury, conflict of interest, and it's a whole. Basically, there was one particular case that was really bad. That was more recent. In a LA City Council member who was sentenced after being caught accepting $1.8 million worth of casino chips, luxury hotel stays, prostitutes, and a liquor box full of cash from Chinese developers. So they collude with development real estate. That's another industry where there's a lot of money, right? Trump's sort of natural habitat, real estate. There's a lot of money, a lot of corruption, and they would make it where they would provide development contracts and all these kinds of things in exchange for those rewards. In New Jersey, you had Senator Robert Menendez, who was convicted of 16 felonies for taking gold, cash, and luxury cars in exchange for trying to aid the governments of Egypt and Qatar. So it's absolutely everywhere. This is baked into American capitalism, really.
So, the corruption that's going on now, we should be clear. Corruption is a necessary part of capitalism since it began. There wasn't a golden age. Sometimes, like, if you hear Bernie Sanders, he kind of implies that, in the past we had honest government, and now all of a sudden we're because of the Supreme Court ruling on unlimited contributions on election, now everything is corrupt. That's not really true. Capitalism has always been a system where once you establish a government and a state apparatus, that's a cash cow. So the capitalists are competing to get contracts and sell things to the government. They're competing to get privileges from that government, like places that they can drill for oil, or for example, the U.S. railroad system. When they were trying to implement Manifest Destiny, they were expanding from the 13 original states in the east coast of the United States and expand all the way towards the west coast to the Pacific. They had to lay a lot of railroad track. Railroads were competing for who's going to get that territory, who's going to own that land, who's going to be able to, run those tracks all the way to the west coast. So there was all kinds of corruption in the government all through those days. It's nothing new. Marx and Engels wrote, that the stock market basically dominated Congress, right? And they were writing in the 1800s. There's nothing new about that. It's intrinsic to capitalist democracy. There is no capitalist democracy that's not dominated by money and corruption.
A persistent myth of the origins of American democracy is trumpeted by liberal political figures and pounded into our heads by rote as school children. That myth weaves a story that a pantheon of founding fathers, wielding wisdom for the ages, united a new people into a single nation, forging a universally loved system of democratic control over government that has stood the test of time. But this is pure fiction. The truth is that a struggle between different classes over the rights and standards of living of the working masses had grown up in colonial America, driving the revolution forward, and not all the Americans were on the same page. Workers and artisans in the cities, sailors in the ports, and small farmers in the countryside had been fighting back against the oppressive conditions of life imposed on them not only by the British, but by the wealthy merchants of the North and the planters of the South, who had enriched themselves through the exploitation of their labor. A series of slave revolts had challenged the rule of the Southern aristocracy, and it was the working people who formed the revolutionary bands like the Sons of Liberty and the popular volunteer militias, which carried the independence struggle forward. The merchants and planters were trying to make deals with the English crown while the working classes were waging a war of independence. In inspiring the masses of the 13 colonies to overthrow British rule by force and violence in the American Revolutionary War, Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence proclaimed the principle that governments can only claim legitimacy through the consent of the governed. Jefferson's revolutionary slogan of 1776 has been perverted over time by the liberal promoters of capitalist rule into the highest expression of our democratic rights, that is, simply consenting to be governed by one or another representative of the capitalist class every couple of years. Indeed, when the founders of the American Republic drew up the Articles of Confederation, and then later the U.S. Constitution, they instilled certain decidedly anti-democratic measures into the governmental framework. Once the fighting was over, demobilized revolutionary fighters returned to their farms and shops to find the conditions were still just as bad as they had been before the revolution. They began organizing themselves to defend their rights against the rich, demanding the right to elect representatives from among themselves, and relief from the war profiteers who had lined their own pockets during the war. It broke into open armed revolt, for example, in Shays' Rebellion. Frightened at the prospect of popular masses getting control over the governmental power, the coalition of northern merchants and southern planters reinstituted property ownership, male gender, and white skin as conditions for voting, concentrating power in the hands of the rich and disenfranchising the working masses who had fought and won the Revolutionary War. In the election of 1789, out of the 13,000 men living in New York City, only 1,300, or 10%, had enough property to vote. Of the 200,000 residents of New York State, only 12,000 qualified to vote for governor. Behind closed doors, the elite crafted a constitution which insulated the election of the president from the popular vote with the invention of the Electoral College composed of the aristocracy, the same people who wrote the Constitution. They divided the legislative body in two, with an upper house composed of senators appointed by the states without elections, that is, until 1910, giving the least populous states equal power with the most populous. Today, the state of California, with 44 million people, has the same number of senators as Wyoming's 600,000 people. To give the southern planters even more power, they denied the right to vote to both free blacks and slaves, but granted the southern states overrepresentation in the lower house by counting each slave as 3/5 of a person in determining the number of elected representatives each southern state was entitled to. And they instituted an unelected aristocratic board of final political decision made up of officials appointed for life, the Supreme Court. Now, that Constitution only barely gained approval against popular opposition. Only when Jefferson returned from his ambassadorship to France in 1789 and had organized the inclusion of the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, which convinced workers and farmers that the new government would defend the rights they had fought for, was the Constitution approved. The fight of workers in the North for democratic rights scored some extension of voting rights in the first decades of the 19th century, but was subsumed into the corrupt capitalist political machines of New York and other big cities, eventually forming in coalition with the slavocracy, the Democratic Party, which took over power in the federal government with the election of Andrew Jackson in 1828 and held back the development of industry for decades until the Second American Revolution, the Civil War, finally overthrew the slavocracy. But even that revolutionary event could not secure the franchise for blacks or women. It took 180 years of struggle from below for universal suffrage to finally be won, with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that finally overthrew Jim Crow. What the liberals call democracy is nothing other than thinly veiled rule by the capitalist class, fighting tooth and nail against working class efforts to defend and extend our democratic rights. Working people still jealously guard our real democratic rights. All the while, the government of the rich attacks our freedom of speech, breaks up mass meetings, calls out the National Guard against popular protests, breaks down the separation of church and state, and monopolizes political discussion. This is the real legacy of the so-called Founding Fathers, and why the working class, now the absolute majority of the population, needs its own communist party to fight for a workers' government and real democracy.
Lenin did say that under a bourgeois system, finance capital can freely bribe and buy any government and any official. And I think we've given ample proof of this. There's WikiLeaks that came out about Obama, where basically Citibank picked his cabinet. And this is before he was elected. So it was, say, October of 2008. An executive of Citigroup emails Obama and tells him, basically gives him a list of potential people that he should put in his cabinet. He attached 3 documents: a list of women for top administration jobs, a list of non-white candidates, and he divides it by race. He says, these are Native American people, some black, some Latino, and it's a list divided by those categories, and says, the lists will continue to grow, but these are the names to date that seem to be coming up as recommended by various sources for senior level jobs. So 2 things on this. First of all, literally you can see that the cabinet that Obama picked, on the whole, 100% corresponded to that which Citibank asked him to put in. Citibank, which became the recipient of the largest bailout of the one of the recipients of the largest bailout after the 2008 crisis, had mapped out virtually the entire cabinet for Obama. You can also see the role that identity politics plays. They put on this nice mask. They say, oh, we are good, we're progressive, we're liberal. You see, we have a very diverse cabinet. It's very diverse in race, and it's very diverse, and there's a lot of women in it, and this and that. It's not diverse in one thing. They're all capitalist politicians that are picked by Citibank, picked by the banks, by Wall Street, and controlled by them 100%. You can see how they use this strategy of identity politics to try to put a smokescreen and distract from the fundamental class interests controlling these governments.
Right, and so after the 2008 crisis, you see these huge bank bailouts. You saw the Troubled Asset Relief Program, which authorized the Department of the Treasury to buy up $700 billion in toxic assets from these companies. And the Treasury Department was also authorized to buy up $250 billion in bank shares. It bought $20 billion in shares each just from Bank of America and Citigroup.
Now, Lenin, I think also in The State and Revolution, he paraphrases Marx, who says that the oppressed are allowed once every few years to decide which particular representatives of the oppressing class shall represent and repress them in parliament. So again, we only have the choices that they give us, and every few years we get to vote on those options. Although I will say there's also a lot of restrictions, even on that formal democracy for the rich. Immigrants can't vote until they get U.S. citizenship, basically.
And that takes a long time.
That takes a long time, and it's not guaranteed. You can be rejected as well. But the immigrant population in the U.S. is nearly 50 million people. None of those who are workers that are essential to the U.S. economy can vote. People that are convicted of felonies also can vote. That's about 5 million people, give or take, in the United States, which is the country with the single largest prison population in the world. I think the prison population right now is something like 1.3 million.
Yeah, and just on the felony conviction, just remember something. Trump said that the criminal justice system was rigged against him. It's not rigged against him, but it is rigged against the working class. They prosecute crime in the streets, but they don't prosecute crime in the suites for the most part, right? So it's mainly targeted against working class people, and many, many people are unjustly convicted of felonies that, in fact, they never really committed. Like we got false confessions that were extracted by the police and stuff. So it's definitely a way of getting working class people. Of course, particularly there's a lot of racism in the criminal justice, particularly Black and Latino workers. Another way to prevent them from voting, basically.
Absolutely.
And in addition to the voting issue, you have you have the ability to restrict who you can vote for, because there's a question of ballot access in this country. In this country, you have basically two parties, the Democratic and Republican Party, which are linked with the state apparatus itself, right? You want to join the party, what you do is when you go register to vote, you actually declare a party, a Democrat or a Republican. So the two parties are actually linked with the state. They're not even independent of the state. Both of these parties are parties completely dominated by the capitalist class. And those are the parties you have to choose from. Because if you try to vote for a third party, well, can you? Do they have ballot access? And they make it very, very difficult in all the states of this country. Some states are worse than others, but they make it very difficult for people, for third parties, for other parties, for potential working class parties to get ballot status. And even, for example, in New York State, a few years back, the Green Party, which is like an environmentalist, like middle class party, but they successfully followed these horrible rules, and they were able to get ballot status in New York. So then Governor Cuomo at that time changed the rules and made it harder for them. Now they're not on the ballot. So, for example, in this coming election, Jill Stein in New York has to write a write-in campaign. She has to run a write-in campaign. She's not on the ballot, so people can't vote. If they don't want to vote for the Democrats and the Republicans who both, for example, support the war against the Palestinian people, and they wanted to cast a protest vote for Jill Stein in New York, you have to write her in. You don't have the ability, the option to even vote for her.
Absolutely. And we are actually seeing there is a rise in support for Jill Stein right now, for the simple fact that she doesn't endorse U.S. imperialism and the genocidal slaughter that they're carrying out right now in Gaza. You have the ground invasion in Lebanon has started. That's sure to cause a lot more death, a lot more destruction. Already 1 million people have been displaced, and people are disgusted by this. And I think it's a significant development that there's a big chunk of the population, especially among the Muslim American population in Michigan and other places, that are voting third party, that are voting for Jill Stein or writing her in, I guess, as a part of that.
And I also want to point out, the Democratic Party is accusing Trump of being anti-democratic. He's going to be a dictator. Who is the main force keeping the Green Party off the ballot, keeping that choice from the American people? It's the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is running overtime, funding tons of lawyers to keep Jill Stein off the ballot in many, many states.
Another issue, too, where there's restrictions on voting or who you get to vote for is gerrymandering, which is also, again, part of the legacy of racism and the present of racism in this country, where you have this just ridiculous, absurd lines that for the districts of the voting that correspond to the poorest neighborhoods, which tend to be also the segregated neighborhoods, the Black neighborhoods, the Latino neighborhoods, so that they don't get to vote in where the rich people are having to vote.
Well, yeah, just one thing on gerrymandering, just to give an example. In the future, if let's say when we are able to build a larger party, and when we run somebody, if we win that, like a district in Congress, I can guarantee you they'll redistrict that district so that they'll knock out our Congress, the communist congressman. That's for sure.
There's a lot of institutions in American bourgeois democracy and in the system as a whole, even worldwide, that are not elected, that have a huge influence in what happens to people's lives. Even think about the Fed. They get increase interest rate, lower interest rate, play with people's mortgage and loans and credit card debt, and that's no one elected that. And that was actually, it's interesting to look at how the Fed even got started in a private meeting of bankers getting together in a secret island and discussing the setup of the Fed, which is basically a central bank, right, in all but name. You also have the judicial system, right, the Supreme Court.
We can see, throughout its entire history, the court has been a profoundly conservative institution. It's basically the only formal limit to their decisions is precedent, right? And there's this idea that these judges are neutral, like they're almost like gods overseeing the rest of the government to check them and make sure everything's okay. But these are human beings, right? And they're human beings that have been through the racist, the racist courts that make all these rulings against the poor, against the working class, against immigrants, just as susceptible to bribery as all these other Congress people that we've been talking about. You had bribery like a $500,000 trip to Indonesia. So you see basically that the Supreme Court protects the corporation's right to their First Amendment. Their First Amendment right is protected, but and this is kind of leading into another topic. But the students who sympathize with the Palestine movement don't have their freedom of speech protected.
Lenin once said that bourgeois democracy is always narrow, it's hypocritical, it's spurious, and false. It always remains democracy for the rich and a swindle for the poor. And I think, all these examples, the justice system is controlled by a clique of unelected, unaccountable judges that are there for life, that make these decisions not on the basis of popular opinion, but on the basis of protecting the interests of the ruling class as a whole. And like you said, this bleeds into the question of freedom of speech. That's the other thing, like people think America is democracy and freedom. And yet, there's all these restrictions, actually, in reality, on normal people, everyday people, to actually have things like freedom of speech. Going into the question of the pro-Palestine movement, there's been a series of brutal attacks, even just in the streets, in terms of the number of arrests, right? I mean, what was it, the number of arrests that...
The amount of people, this is what the New York Times reported, was they said in the spring of 2024, the amount of people arrested from the Palestinian protests was more or less equal to the amount of people arrested like in 1971 at the height of the anti-Vietnam War movement, which involved millions of people. The Palestinian protests were much smaller proportionately, but yet you had the same number of arrests. So it just shows you the repression.
Absolutely. A brutal crackdown in the campuses as well, where a lot of students got arrested as part of the encampment movement. They got attacked by Zionist mobs that colluded with the police, as happened in UCLA. And by the way, we saw LA, a very corrupt city council, and they sent in the police to repress the students and colluded with the Zionist mob. And now you have, in the aftermath of this, that's continued, and there's severe restrictions being placed on freedom of speech in the campuses.
Yeah, absolutely. You see all of these attacks across the campus on freedom of speech. At the University of California, for this fall semester, the administration has banned face masks to prevent protesters from concealing their identities when they're protesting.
Which, how do you know if someone's putting on a mask for COVID reasons or to conceal their identity? I guess they're just gonna guess and use it how they...
Yeah. And students at NYU can be disciplined completely just for for using the word Zionist or Zionism. It's a blacklisted word. So you have your freedom of speech, except for these words, right? Which doesn't bother us, of course, because we can still make the same case against U.S. imperialism. The phrase U.S. imperialism isn't banned, and we can absolutely point out all of the ways in which U.S. imperialism is backing this genocide. U.S. imperialism is taking all of this money that could be used for healthcare, for education, for giving student loan debt, and instead spending it on bombs and sending it to Israel. You don't have to use the word Zionism to explain that.
Yeah, but it's significant because this is part of this the media conspiracy and like the entire ruling class that want to equate Zionism with anti-Semitism. It's got nothing to do with that. What, Zionism is basically saying you support the Israeli state and its actions, which is carrying out a bloody genocide in Gaza. And that's not the same as anti-Semitism, which would be discriminating against someone for being a Jew, which absolutely we condemn 100%. But those two things are being equated, and they say, well, if you say you're Zionist, then you're anti-Semitic.
Yeah, and we should be clear, Zionism was premised on the idea you're taking what was a homeland for two people, dividing it, partitioning it at the expense, in favor of one at the expense of the other. That's the problem, right? Because it wasn't like there was an empty land and then they were giving someone a homeland. It wasn't that. There was actually two different groups there. To partition it and in favor of one against the other was absolutely criminal thing.
Careful not to say that on the
At
NYU
NYU.
campus, you might
Yeah.
get kicked out.
Yeah, I mean, and your form of protest, your form of being able to express your opinion on these campuses is being more and more limited. At Drexel University in Philadelphia, the administration banned encampments, basically, Indiana University has instituted wide-ranging new expressive activities policy, right? There's a ban on political discussions after 11 p.m., basically, right? And it raised their budget for the campus security officers. So they're preparing to suppress more of the students' free speech in event of another Palestine movement or other movements.
Absolutely. By the way, at Drexel University, they banned unregistered or unauthorized campus teach-ins, rallies, and protests. The irony that in what should be, the hallmark of free education and free thinking and whatever, you can't have a teach-in that is not sanctioned by the administration, which they're going to use that in a political way. They're going to allow what they want to allow, and they're not going to allow what they don't want to allow. And the reason there's big interest in this, we know there's a lot of the people that are making donations to these universities, which are CEOs and billionaires, who are the ones that also prop up the U.S. imperialist intervention in Israel, are the ones that are pushing these things. There was a particularly egregious case, by the way, where more than a dozen members of Forbes' annual list of billionaires and other sort of real estate, finance, and communications big business people got together. They had a group chat, and they basically colluded to then have a Zoom call with New York Mayor Eric Adams and convinced him to send the NYPD to crush the Columbia University and CCNY encampments. So there you have it again. You have the capitalist class getting together, making the decisions, calling the shots to absolutely crush the Columbia and CCNY encampments.
We should always be clear that democratic rights are not given to us from the ruling class. They're fought for. We win these democratic rights as a byproduct of the struggle of the working class. Whenever the ruling class is threatened, and I'm going to go through a couple historical points, they tend to clamp down on rights because it's, by the way, it's not a point of strength. It's a point of weakness. It's because they're fearing the masses. Remember, if there's just a few percentage of them, and we are the overwhelming majority of society, we are 90% of society, then they get frightened when the masses start becoming conscious and start fighting for their rights and start seeing the contradictions about what they're being told by the ruling class and what the accurate truth is of the way life really works under capitalism. I want to point out there used to be this poster. It was meant as partially a political commentary and partially as a joke. It used to have a poster of the Bill of Rights, and it had a big stamp on it and said, "Void where prohibited by law." But in a certain sense, that's exactly the way the capitalist class functions. They have the Bill of Rights. These are your constitutional rights, and then they're void when they want to prohibit it by law. For example, let's talk about the First Amendment, the right of free speech, right? So you had, for example, in World War I, a famous case where the U.S. By the way, President Wilson got elected and reelected on the promise promise of keeping the United States out of the war. Then he breaks his promise. He gets the U.S. involved in the imperialist conflict in World War I on the side of Britain and France, because that's where the commercial ties were for U.S. imperialism at the time. And anybody who started to oppose the war, the state apparatus started to clamp down on them. Famous example was Eugene Debs, the leader of the Socialist Party. You know what crime he committed? He was arrested, put in federal prison, right, for many years. And the crime he committed was that he spoke against the war, right? And when that went to the Supreme Court, by the way, even the liberal justice, right, Brandeis, I think, wrote and said, well, what Debs was doing was shouting fire in a crowded theater, which is, of course, not true. If you shout fire in a crowded theater, you could lead to injury and death to people. Eugene Debs wasn't leading people to their death. He was actually trying to save people from the horrors of World War I, from the maiming and the killing and all the butchery that was being done. That's what he was trying to...
20 million people died in that war.
Exactly, you know. And so he was in jail. By the way, when he ran for president in 1920, he was in prison at that time. He couldn't campaign. He still got almost 1 million votes, but he couldn't campaign. So that was another person was a socialist congressman, Victor Berger. I think he was a congressman from Milwaukee, Wisconsin at the time. He was thrown out of Congress also because he was against intervention in that war. So you see these kinds of attacks on the freedom of speech. And what does the First Amendment say? The Congress shall make no law, right? Shall make no law to ban freedom of speech. And then they passed a law. I think it was called the Espionage Act or whatever. But if they don't have that law, they find another law to use against people. We've also seen, for example, in World War II, the U.S. government took American citizens and legal American residents whom were not citizens, who were of Japanese descent. And they took them without going to court, without trial. They took them all and said, you are going to live in these concentration camps, which they lived in for the entire length of World War II. Not because they were convicted of spying or espionage or sabotage. No, just because they were of Japanese descent. And it included, by the way, not just resident aliens, it included citizens of the United States. And I mean, that's a famous example. In the 1950s, you had, for a number of years, the top leadership of the Communist Party was put in prison. Why? Basically because they were communists, right? They say, well, they were conspiring to overthrow the U.S. government. That was crap, because the government never showed that they were plotting the overthrow of the U.S. The fact is they were just preaching the ideas. Actually, we would say that they were preaching a reformist version of the ideas of communism. But the fact is that's what they were thrown in jail for. So you see time after time, rights are being denied.
And we can see this in the example of our comrade Milos at the Minneapolis airport. We reported on this situation just a few podcast episodes ago, I think a couple months ago, where the comrade was arrested, their security badge taken away, lost their job, all for the crime of talking to their coworkers and distributing leaflets.
Comrade Milos worked for a restaurant. It was beyond the security perimeter at the airport. Comrade Milos was on break. During their break, they took a flyer and they were passing it out to coworkers. That's all. It's a right during their break, at work, to talk to coworkers and to discuss with them politically. For that, what happened is somebody complained. The police came. The Minneapolis airport police, I should say, came, and Milos was escorted out of the airport. The badge was taken away from Milos. Milos was fired. Milos was prohibited from going to the airport for a year unless they're a ticketed passenger. And Milos also has to pay something like a $300 fine, all for just simply discussing politics, providing a communist literature to their coworker during their break. Now, does anybody listening to this podcast feel that if Milos was passing out things from the Bible or religious material, or maybe even campaign literature for Harris or Trump, does anybody believe that Milos would have been treated in this manner? I think the question answers itself.
Absolutely. And by the way, I think the charge that was brought on the comrade was changed, which shows they just wanted to get rid of them for their ideas. And then when one charge didn't work, they switched to another. I think the first charge was something like protected speech in inappropriate space. Or
Being involved in constitutionally protected speech in a certain area. Now the authorities claim that Milos was misusing the badge, but that's not the case. Milos was on break and spoke to coworkers. That's all that happened.
Yeah, and they're being fined. And if you would like to donate to the RCA to help our comrades fight against these egregious attacks and help build the party that is distributing communist propaganda and fighting to change society, then you can do so with the link in the description. Now, let's make it clear, you can't distribute your own leaflet, even though you're supposed to have freedom of speech and freedom of press, and yet you might get fired for putting forward your ideas at your workplace. And you're certainly not going to be allowed to just put forward your own personal individual opinion in the mass media, which is really, as we discussed at the beginning of the episode, this is where this is what the vast majority of the population will be able to access: the TV, even the social media. It's owned by big corporations, and so it's fake. You don't actually have freedom of the press when all the main press are actually owned and controlled by the big capitalists. Just to give a few examples, the top 5 American news media companies and their stakeholders. Comcast Corporation, which owns NBC. They also own USA Network, Sci-Fi, Oxygen. All of these are obviously media conglomerates. They're monopolies. They own many, many channels and many different outlets. The top stakeholders are Vanguard Group, BlackRock, and State Street Corporation. If you look at the second media company in the US, Warner Brothers, which owns also a ton of different outlets, including HBO and CNN worldwide, the top stakeholders are Vanguard Group, BlackRock, and State Street Corporation. These are asset management companies, a big finance capital, basically, right? Fox Corporation, top stakeholders, Vanguard Group, BlackRock, and Dodge and Cox. I don't know what that one is. Another asset management company, probably. But in the fourth place, State Street Corporation. If you look at News Corporation, which owns the New York Post, the Dow Jones and Company, Consumer Media Group, the Wall Street Journal, and a lot of other kind of financial newspapers and such, State Street Corporation, Vanguard, and BlackRock are actually number 4, 5, and 6. So the top 3 are different, but again, you can see all of these are owned by big capital, big finance investors. The New York Times Company, the top 2, Vanguard Group, and BlackRock. So I think that makes it perfectly clear.
Yeah, we don't have to go into the individuals who invest in those things, but we know we obviously know the Murdoch family with Fox and News Corp. But yeah,
and this explains we talked about earlier how they represent the interests of the candidates. They prop up the rhetoric of the Democrats or the Republicans, basically the rhetoric of the ruling class. And you can see this even in subtle ways. When you read the New York Times every morning, the hypocrisy is just so nauseating. When they talk about, say, Hamas shooting a rocket into Israel, they talk about murder and their horrible terrorism and barbaric reaction and this and that. But when they talk about the Israeli pager explosions, which was a carefully planned terrorist attack on Lebanese people, including a lot of just regular citizens. Children died in that attack. The New York Times described it as an audacious attack. Can you imagine if people in the campuses went out and said that October 7th was an audacious attack? There would be a huge uproar. There has been a huge uproar, right? And so you can see it reeks of hypocrisy. When they bomb Hezbollah, they say they bombed Hezbollah. In reality, they bomb a residential building, and they say Hezbollah was somewhere in there, you know? So it's indiscriminate killings, and the way to describe it is in total contrast with when Israel fires a rocket into Lebanon or into Gaza. They don't say Israel killed or Israel murdered. They say a rocket or someone has been killed by a rocket, 30 children have been killed by a rocket. They don't say, the Israeli state has carried out a murderous bombing campaign, right? So even in subtle ways, the way they describe things, they massage the rhetoric that they use to basically try to skew public opinion. As we've seen, of course, it doesn't always work. And actually, there's been a shift in the public mood, in the consciousness, in terms of support for the Palestinian cause, especially among the youth, as we saw with the example of the Palestine movement last year, and especially the encampments earlier this year.
Lenin has an excellent quote to describe this sort of almost monopoly that the capitalist class as a whole has on the media, and how the capitalist class gets to decide what story gets told. He says, in practice, the capitalists, the exploiters, the landowners, and the profiteers own 9/10 of the best meeting halls and 9/10 of the stocks of newsprint, printing presses, etc. The present freedom of assembly and the press in the democratic, in quotes, democratic, bourgeois democratic republic is false and hypocritical, because in fact, it is freedom for the rich to buy and bribe the press, freedom for the rich to befuddle the people with venomous lies of the bourgeois press, freedom for the rich to keep as their property the landowners, mansions, the best buildings, etc.
Yeah, and again, we should reiterate that is why we have our own press, an independent newspaper, an independent website, a podcast that is funded fully by our comrades, our supporters.
Yeah, the capitalists spend hundreds of millions of dollars in order to, shape public opinion. And even with all this money, right, still a majority of working people don't think politicians represent them. But our comrades, with a $5 paper, The Communist, and flyers, leaflets that we get printed for usually under $1 each, these newspapers and leaflets point out the hypocrisy of the real class interests of the capitalist politicians, and they put forward the case for a new party for the working class. And we're finding tremendous success just with our meager resources, being able to connect that message to lots of people. And we're getting stories every day submitted through our press portal on our website of this taking place.
We met a woman who was on the bench, and she was sort of looking at us. And we basically came up to her, and we had our Neither Party Represents the Working Class pamphlet. And that's what Will said. And this woman lit up and she said, yeah, neither party represents us. And she gave us the story of how she came to that conclusion. The fact that, she's a working class mom. She works at a school cafeteria. She has 2 daughters, and it's always a hassle to get bills paid on time. And the poignant words that she said was, these people don't live like we do. They don't understand what it's like to live with 2 daughters. They don't understand what it's like to live paycheck to paycheck. They don't go through these struggles. Why do they get to represent us when we have no say? So we gave her a bunch of our Neither Party pamphlets, both in English and Spanish. She said that she was going to give it to the bus driver because the bus was coming. And, we're still in touch. We've invited her to our events in the Boston area.
So everything we can get in terms of resources that helps us. We utilize that so effectively to spread out these ideas and actually connect with people in a way that the capitalists, despite their hundreds of millions, cannot, frankly, because it doesn't match with what working class people are seeing in their reality. We don't get funding from Bloomberg, from Disney, from any of these.
No BlackRock and State Street funding in the RCA.
Yeah, exactly. So the support we get, it comes from the working class, the people who actually support these ideas.
A big part of our media operation, if you will, is of course that we're building an actual party, which is a network of revolutionaries that can bring these ideas out. So I would say if you enjoy what you're listening to right now, you should apply to join the party, get involved, and become one of these cadre revolutionaries who are actually spreading a consistent revolutionary communist message to your coworkers, to your friends, to your neighbors, and so forth. But also you can subscribe to the communists. You can become a sustaining member, support the party with a monthly donation, and get the newspaper shipped to your door every month so you can read the latest in communist news and analysis. Now, I hope that through this episode, we have made it fairly clear why the so-called democracy under capitalism is a sham. It's only democracy for a minority, whereas the vast majority is excluded from that. And I think all of that, we can see how there's 1,000,001 threads that tie the state with the ruling class. I think that should answer this reformist illusion that one could simply get elected and start to pass legislation, and little by little, you just basically curb the capitalism out of capitalism, and you reform your way into socialism. That is false. The state is not some kind of neutral arbiter that exists just to kind of moderate any excesses or whatever. It's a tool of the ruling class to manage the common affairs of the ruling class, as Marx pointed out. And I think there's plenty of data that we provided to prove this, and also plenty of historical examples of attempts to reform capitalism that didn't work, to basically use the state apparatus in order to change itself. There's one particularly, I would say, stark example that many of our listeners, many people in the US might not be familiar with it, but I think it's a very instructive one. It's this left-wing leader, a socialist politician in France called Mitterrand.
François Mitterrand. Yeah.
François Mitterrand was elected in May 1981, and he was elected on a program of mass nationalization, on tax on the rich, wealth taxes, and a higher minimum wage. So that was his mandate. The majority of the population elected him to carry out this program. And he actually did it, which, a lot of the time there's so much pressure early on that they actually cave before they even implement those policies. But he actually tried. So he put 12 monopolies and 38 banks into public ownership, and the minimum wage was increased by 10%. What did the ruling class do? Immediately, he faced a massive backlash. You had a flight of capital. Every day, there were hundreds of thousands, millions of francs that were escaping the country. There was a capital strike, basically. There was no more investment. And eventually, he had to cave. There was massive inflation. The economy was crumbling. And he had to accept the dictates of the market. Just 1 or 2 years later, what did he do? He implements austerity. He cuts the budget. And he removes, there used to be wages were linked to prices, which would basically mean if there's inflation, your wages also go up. It's something we would argue for. He removed that and so forth. You can see he was forced to do this. There would have been an alternative. The alternative would have been to actually break with capitalism altogether and to fight for workers' democracy, for the workers themselves to take over and run the economy and do it in a way that benefits our interest, our common interest, as opposed to the interest of the ruling class. There's plenty other examples, maybe even more recent examples of this.
You also had Syriza in Greece elected on the platform of rejecting austerity from the EU, of standing up against kind of forced budget cuts, right? And once elected, of course, had to go completely back on all of those promises. And you can see the state of Syriza today. It's completely crumbled because it betrayed its own base of support completely.
And that was in response to the 2008 crisis, a devastating situation. And then he did end up implementing austerity, which again just caused a horrible, horrible situation for the vast majority of the working class in Greece. And there's example after example. You could talk about Chile in 1973 with Allende and so on and so forth. And today in the US, you have people with those illusions, the Bernie Sanderses and AOCs who maybe started to get into politics thinking you can get in and change it from the inside. What ends up happening is either you get controlled and tamed and you end up towing the line imposed by the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, and the entire American democratic machine, or you get kicked out one way or another.
Yeah, just on Allende, we should point out that they had a constitution, and that constitution didn't stop the Chilean bourgeois, the Chilean military apparatus, and U.S. imperialism from violating that Constitution, throwing the government out, and literally starting a spree of murder and torture. They took a sports stadium and turned it into a torture chamber, for example. I think that all that would have probably violated the Chilean Constitution, but that Constitution ultimately is a piece of paper, right? And it doesn't stop the bourgeois reaction from implementing what they feel is in their interest.
And it's a good reminder that democracy is not the only way for the capitalists to rule. When it's their preferred way because it's a bit more stable, right?
It's cheaper.
It's cheaper. You can cover up. It has a veneer of respectability, and it basically fools people into thinking that they have a say in things. But if they have to resort to dictatorship or other forms of rule, they do so as long as they can maintain their economic power, which is what is fundamentally important under capitalism. So we talk about you cannot just use the existing state machine and try to reform it, such as it is. So what do we actually fight for?
Well, the first thing is the working class is a class, it's the vast majority of society. It needs its own political party. It doesn't have a political party right now. So right now, if you are a worker and you're listening to this podcast, if you're a person who says, yes, the working class does need its own political party, you should really reach out and join with us in the Revolutionary Communists of America, because we're not only building our party, which eventually could become the mass party of the working class, but we'll also work with other genuine elements who want to build a mass workers' party in this country, because the working class, the overwhelming majority, does not have a party right now, and it needs a party. And another thing that we're going to do is the other mass organization, if you want to say, that defends the working class, at least at the workplace and in industry, is the trade unions. And our party is going to fight with the rank and file to regain control of these trade unions. Unfortunately, the leadership of these trade unions is completely linked with the ruling class, completely linked with the Democrats. Some of them evidently want to go over to the Trump side. But the fact is that they're linked with the enemy class, the class enemy. We need to fight the capitalist class, not make deals with them. So we want to fight to regain these unions, and these unions and the building of a mass workers' party in the future can help us to fight to eventually get to a workers' government. And the workers' government is what's going to transform society, because once we establish a workers' government, then we're going to establish a government which would nationalize the big 500 companies, the monopolies that run this society. Then we'd be able to use the wealth that's created in this society. By the way, the wealth that's created from the labor of the working class applied to the natural resources that this earth has produced, and that's what creates all the wealth, and we'd be able to use that to meet everybody's needs. And believe me, there's plenty of wealth there, and we can make more. We can end the industries of death, like the military industries, and turn that into something that's socially useful. That can be done under a nationalized planned economy. So all of those things can be done. And in a workers' government, what we would have is a system not where people serve in government and then they go into the private sector and make millions. No, we would end that, because we'd end the private sector. We would have the companies would be nationalized under democratic workers' control. Public officials would be paid the average salary of a worker. Public officials not only would be elected at intervals, but they could be recalled. So you elect somebody and they're not doing what they said they were going to do, then there should be some sort of process to recall that elected official, get them back, and then we can elect somebody who will follow the will of the working class. That's the kind of democracy we want. We would have a rotation of tasks and responsibilities, so that everybody would be playing their role in running society, and we wouldn't allow the establishment of an entrenched bureaucracy, which of course would cut across the attempts at workers' democracy. That's the kind of vision we can have. It's all very practical. It's more practical now with the technology and that we have today in the world than it's ever been. It's really it's not a technical problem, it's a political problem.
Absolutely. And I think this is a good way to end, to answer this slander that the communists, they want dictatorship, they want to get rid of freedom and democracy and all of this. It's absolutely false. What we do want to end is we want to end the dictatorship of the capitalists, which is what we currently have under capitalism. American bourgeois democracy is where you have a small minority of the Fortune 500 CEOs, Wall Street, the banks. They're the ones that exert a dominance over the vast majority of society. And we fight for a real, genuine democracy of the majority against this parasitic minority. So, when we talk about, when Lenin or Marx in their time talk about dictatorship of the proletariat, they're not talking about a one-party state or anything along those lines. They're actually talking about the proletariat, the working class as a class, coming to power through a workers' government, through a workers' party, and ruling society in the interest of the majority of society.
And if I can just add, remember that the dictatorship of the capitalist class is the small group of people live at the expense of the vast majority. In a workers' democracy, the majority are ruling, and they're stopping the exploitation. They're not exploiting the minority, they're stopping the exploitation of the majority by the minority.
And just to quote Lenin, he says that the period of transition to communism will, for the first time, create democracy for the people, for the majority, along with the necessary suppression of the exploiters, who are the minority. Communism alone is capable of providing really complete democracy, and that is what we fight for.